Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today I want to call on two of my stalwart members of Project Save the World. Both of them are section editors, and I should explain what a section editor is. On our website, a section editor actually can do several things. They can write articles for the magazine, they can host talk shows, and they don't normally do much of that, but one thing they do is monitor the comments on the webpage. And I have to remind people to go there and use that facility, because those of us who love and work with Project Save the World share ideas, or even ideas that we've stolen from other people, on the website to savetheworld.ca. And Brad and Ole make it their business to monitor what goes on there. So if you put up dirty pictures or something, they would take them down. Mm-hmm. They are, Brad works on the global warming page of the Project Save the World. The page is called to savetheworld.ca. And Ole is the section editor for the page on radioactive contamination. So they have not met until now, but both of them are environmentalists and obviously have overlapping or converging interests. Brad Bass is a status assistant professor in the School of Environment at University of Toronto, and he works on the Canada's Great Lakes Nutrient Initiative team, where he focuses on water quality policy and ways of reducing the urban phosphorus loads into the Great Lakes. He's also a great teacher. He likes to work with groups of students who are interested in the environment. Ole Hendrickson lives up in Quebec.
Part of the time I'm on the municipality of L'Île-aux-Allumettes in Pontiac of West Quebec.
All right, very good.
But I'm in Ottawa today.
Okay, very good. And like me, you're retired. Professionally, I understand that Ole is an ecologist. And the last job, I guess, is he worked for Environment Canada on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So his great interest is in diversity. And he's active in the nuclear cleanup efforts and has served as editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Biodiversity. He works with the Ottawa River Institute and the Sierra Club Canada Foundation. Okay. I don't really normally read so much stuff about people, but I want to make sure that everybody gets to know you, and better than I do so far. And it's a good chance for us to.
And Meta, I should make two small corrections. One's a correction, one's an update. On the correction side, I am a status professor with the School of the Environment. Assistant professors and adjunct professors are all very different at the University of Toronto. So, my title is status professor. It means I'm an external research professor. I'm not one paid by the university.
Okay.
And as of October 3rd, I'm no longer working with the Great Lakes Nutrients team. I've moved on to a different position, but in the last month. So I'm actually now a senior policy analyst with Employment and Social Development Canada, working on labor market economics.
Oh, that's real shift. You're going from things to people, right?
Well, it was always people. When I worked on the Great Lakes, primarily we were working with people. The issue really, in many ways, is a people issue.
Yeah, we're our own worst enemies. That's true. Okay, well, I'm glad to be corrected. He says we're going to talk about your common interest in waterways, among other things. And I don't know anything about waterways, except the idea is we shouldn't poison ourselves with fouling our rivers and streams and lakes, right? So, and both of you are working on different aspects of the pollution of water. One, Brad, I guess, largely with the runoff of fertilizer, and I guess only with nuclear contamination. Is that right?
Well, I have a background in phosphorus and nitrogen and the things that Brad works on in the Great Lakes and other parts of the world myself.
Mhm.
I'm very interested in riparian buffers and how wetlands can help protect water quality. So I think we'll find lots of common interest today.
Let
Yeah,
me, you've just given me a whole question that
okay.
it hadn't occurred to me. When you said the word wetlands, my ears flapped because I've been wanting the last 2 or 3 days to talk to somebody about wetlands. And the reason is this, I'm very interested in a project that may happen, or at least we're looking into it, about doing things on Hudson Bay. And one of the things I came across recently was that there's a large area of lowlands, wetlands, around the southwest sort of edge or bottom of Hudson Bay. And it seems that at least recently, these wetlands have been emitting huge amounts of methane. And it is apparently one of, if not the largest source of methane from soils anywhere in the world now. So there are just two or three really hot spots in the world where we see huge amounts of methane coming up, and it's out of the wetlands around Hudson Bay. Now, my question is this. A year or so ago, we did a talk show with a guy named Ed Struzik, who had a book about swamps and fens and marshes and basically wetlands. There are various words for them, but peat bogs and so on. And his whole cause in life seems to be the emphasis on protecting wetlands because they are so valuable to us in preventing climate change or reducing the rapidity of climate change. So and at the time I thought, well, I had heard that wetlands are a source of methane and not something we should be celebrating, but something we should worry about. And but he didn't seem to feel that way about it, and I can't quote him about his rationale. But when I read this thing a couple of days ago about the wetlands around, Hudson Bay being so problematic, I thought I better check this out again. Are wetlands good or bad?
Oh, wetlands are good. There's absolutely no question about it. What do you think, Brad? I'm not an expert on the Hudson Bay lowlands, which are, one of Canada's major ecozones and extremely extensive, but I had not heard that they are major methane emitters. Have you, Brad?
Yeah, I know the US government, and I just had to check this because I've seen it before. So first of all, I do agree with Ole. Wetlands are great and they should be protected, and they are buffers. I think a great way of thinking of them is that they buffer a lot of, they're the buffer between us and the environment in many ways. But a wetland can be a sink, it can absorb things, but it can be a source. It can also be an emitter. And I know the USGS on their website, talks about wetlands emitting 30% of global methane emissions. Now, I wouldn't get all worked up about that because I'm more concerned about the other 70% of global methane emissions. It's not as if all these greenhouse gases just go away if we go away. They're there for a reason. But it, at least it is correct to say, yes, wetlands emit some methane, but there's going to be a number of things have to happen for wetlands to go from a sink to a source. And in this case, you'd have to have, it depends on the inputs coming into the wetland and where, what those inputs are in terms of its capacity to absorb them. And eventually, yes, it has to let them go.
I would like to recall some work I did on methane many, many years ago when I was in southern Georgia in an agricultural watershed doing my PhD work. And I was taking soil cores out and measuring how much methane would evolve into the headspace above these soil cores in a little glass tube with a rubber stopper. And I discovered that a lot, and I could easily measure the ambient level of methane in the atmosphere. And some of the cores were close to the ambient level. A very few of the cores were well above, and most of the cores were actually below ambient methane because soil organisms actually can oxidize methane and use it as a energy source. So a lot of the majority of my soil cores were actually taking methane out of either the atmosphere or from what was coming up from the soil. So there's a question of how active those methane oxidizing microorganisms might be in the Hudson Bay lowlands, but I suspect that on net there isn't a major emission of methane in there unless, as Brad says, there's some perturbation, because the cores that I saw that had really high methane also had cow patties nearby or high levels of fertilizer, because it was an agricultural watershed. So it's when you get perturbations to the wetland that you're likely to start seeing
I saw a
high
map.
methane.
I wish I'd thought of this in advance, but because I don't think I can quickly show that map, but it was on my screen for several days. So I wish maybe what I'll do is later when I'm editing this, I'll try to find that map and put it in. But it shows how, that this is a source of methane now. Now I assume that it has something to do with the permafrost melting, but I don't know how wetlands and permafrost connect. Presumably these wetlands are most of the time frozen, but now they're melting, and that's why these bacteria are coming to life and producing and chowing down on whatever organic matter is still in the soil and then emitting methane.
Yeah, the organic matter in wetlands is not particularly available to microorganisms unless, again, something's going on, as you say, like permafrost melting, and then you get maybe some readily available carbon, some sugars and such that the bacteria can chow down on, as you say, and they instead of using oxygen or nitrate or sulfate as terminal electron acceptors. I'm getting very technical here. They're using carbon dioxide, and they're sticking they're using carbon dioxide as a terminal electron acceptor, and they're emitting methane. That, again, I'd say is a disturbed environment where that would be happening. And you do see it. I mean, there are these videos of people where the permafrost in Russia is melting, poking a stick in and then lighting a match and having a big flame come up, and methane is certainly a major concern in terms of a greenhouse gas. But you have to realize that these wetlands are huge sinks for carbon dioxide. Every year they're building more vegetation, and they're extremely valuable as for their mitigation of climate change. And we should be encouraging wetlands, not worrying about the methane.
Okay, well, how does it work? Okay, when the thing is a sink, is it because down in there in all of that peat and whatever vegetation is covered up there, that there are a lot of these methanotropic bacteria that are eating the methane? Or how, if you say it's a sink, in what's the function? How does it work?
Yeah, it's the opposite, Meta. They're the because these are so wet environments, wetlands, peatlands. There's very little oxygen, so the oxygen gets used up by microbes, and they have to turn to something else to do their respiration, to eat, basically. So as I said, they first they turn, when they run out of oxygen, they turn to nitrate. Then they turn to, if there's sulfur around, they'll use sulfate. But what there is always a lot of around is carbon dioxide, and they will convert, use carbon dioxide to eat their food and produce methane in situations where it's very wet, very anaerobic. In those wet situations without oxygen, because overall rates of plant decomposition are very slow, the plant matter undecayed just keeps building up year after year after year, and that's what makes the carbon sink. So the microbes that are trying to eat this vegetation that's produced every year can't keep up with it. They only eat some of it, so you get more and more carbon stored as peat. And that's what's happened. That's how fossil fuels were produced many millions of years ago as well. The microbes couldn't eat all the decaying organic matter. And that's what's happening today as we speak in vast areas of Canada, Russia, but in the tropics, there are wetlands too, and in southern Ontario even. We know that the Mer Bleu bog, just outside Ottawa, they've measured this very carefully. Every year they measured it for about a 10-year period. It was a sink for carbon. The peat in that bog was building up year after year, and there was more carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere than going back in.
And we want to keep it wet because when it dries up, it automatically emits carbon, or is it simply that it's vulnerable then to fires?
Both. It automatically emits carbon dioxide because it's dried out, and now the microbes are happily using oxygen and really burning through that carbon that's built up in a wetland. It also actually, they emit a lot of nitrous oxide. That's another thing I worked on for my PhD, and that's the third most important greenhouse gas. So yeah, you don't want to drain wetlands.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that.
And that's probably been part of the issue. There was a time when wetlands were one part of a larger system of water flowing from one place to another. And wetlands played a role in that system of retention and then, managing the flow, basically. What happened is we settled the land and turned more of it from forests and fields into whatever we wanted to use it for. We disconnected wetlands from that system. And so I can't actually say, well, because we cut off this much flow, now the wetland is perturbed and behaves somewhat in a different, in this much of a different manner. But we did disconnect a system that was working quite well to manage water and gases emitted to the atmosphere.
Okay, I'm going to guess that there's a real connection between the part of the reason there may be a difference is that if you were studying things in Georgia, there's no permafrost, but in a Hudson Bay area there is. Yeah. And the project that I'm interested in exploring, and in fact we will be in the next several months having several shows about this on these talk shows, is a possibility of refreezing part of Hudson Bay by spraying seawater over it, which is a very unexplored type of intervention, but it would be wonderful to be able to refreeze or at least keep Hudson Bay frozen throughout the summer in parts of the area. So when I read this piece about the lowlands being a source of methane, I asked Stephen Salter who's the scientist at the University of Edinburgh, who's especially interested in this cloud brightening technology that I just mentioned, which was how we would refreeze the Hudson Bay. And I said, would that solve the problem? And he said, absolutely. So I don't know why, and I didn't explore it with him, but he apparently believes that keeping that wetland area cold would help to reduce the methane emissions. So so I'm wondering, I'll ask him why he thinks that. But the other question that lingers in my mind is about rice paddies, because rice paddies are a wetland type of thing, and I've been told that a large part of the methane in the world comes from rice paddies. And if the Asians would just move over and go back to millet or use barley or something other than rice, and apparently there are certain types of rice that are not as dangerous, but that rice paddies are harmful because of the emissions of methane. Anybody on that?
Oh,
Well, I mean, most sources I've seen on that say yes, rice paddies emit methane. In fact, I've seen some sources claim they're the largest source of global methane. But I'm not an expert on rice cultivation, and so I don't want to. I can give you numbers, but I can't really put the numbers into a context. So I don't want to say yes, if only we got rid of rice paddies, we'd solve the methane issue. But I think what it points out is this: when I hear someone say wetlands account for 30% of the global methane, my first response is, those are natural processes going on in the wetlands as the microbes are forced to metabolize anaerobically. This other 70% comes from other activities. There's animal farming is a source of methane. Rice paddies are a source of methane. And so I think it's important, where is that other 70% coming from? I'm not as worried about wetlands. They do so much good that I somehow, am not really concerned about methane emissions from wetlands, given all the good they do and in the environment. But I am concerned about how many of our other activities have increased methane emissions.
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
all the fugitive emissions from natural gas production and fossil fuels. Let's focus on what we can control as humans. I completely agree with Brad on this. Let's not mess with Mother Earth and say, hey, Mother Earth, your wetlands are emitting too much methane. Let's look at what humans are doing. Maybe we could eat a few less cows. There are a lot of people think that would be a good thing for several reasons.
I shouldn't have sprung this on you, but I actually didn't anticipate we're going to talk about this. It only when you use the word methane did you trigger a whole bunch of associations and questions.
You know what, Meta and Ole, I do have to plug one of my favorite hobby horses, and I've driven some people crazy with this. It's water, wetlands, etc. There's a reason why people are not building more wetlands. They take up space. Wetlands for many people present an opportunity cost. If I convert land to wetlands, I can't use it for some other productive purpose that has a higher return on investment for me. So, and some of those returns on investment are valuable to everybody, like food production. So I'm very big on this idea of, I called it vertical wetlands, thinking I was so original building wetlands vertically, using artificial construction methods based on what we know about living wall construction. And then I found out there's a whole literature, but they call it constructed vertical flow wetlands. So for about 10 or 15 years have been people talking about this idea. But this notion that, if we can do it vertically, we can take up less space. And if we can do it above ground, artificially or in an engineered manner, we can do it in a way that can also be removed if necessary without a lot of cost and a lot of damage to the environment in doing so. And so I just want to put a plug in. Wetlands are good. We should be encouraging more wetlands constructed where we can construct them on farms and cities. And if we cannot construct them as horizontal wetlands, the way nature created most of them, there are opportunities to construct them vertically so they go up and take up a smaller footprint.
Tell me how.
I mean, this is the type of thing where now would be great to actually do a field trip with the camera, and I could show you some examples. And these are not vertical wetlands I'm speaking of. They're constructions that are vertical ecosystems, let's say, but they end up replicating a lot of wetland functions because of the sheer amount of water that goes through them. So, so you can basically create systems where you incorporate fish and plants and water and bacteria together, but instead of working with the water on top and soil and plants on the bottom, you have a system where the water runs through a vertical structure where you have big things like the fish at the bottom, and the biomass gets lighter and lighter as you move towards the top. And it turns out these structures do a very good job, for a lot of reasons, of removing various pollutants from water in a way that wetlands do as well, and storing them in the plants or other biomass of the system. And I think there's opportunity. Well, I'm not the only one. Again, I thought I was so original, and it turns out I feel like I never come up with anything original. Everybody has always come up with the idea ahead of me, but that's fine. I'm quite glad to share the idea that you can go back about 20 years in the literature, various places around the globe, and see people talking about what they call constructed vertical flow wetlands.
Brad, this sounds somewhat similar. I know you've done a lot of work on green roofs, so you're sort of taking some of those concepts and adding water, basically,
Yeah.
aren't you?
And turning the roof sideways. So it's not quite a green wall. It's more than just a green wall, because I'm adding fish in many cases into it. The idea of we try to create an ecosystem, but it has to be managed. It's vertical. Most of the examples I know of are actually indoors. They're used inside buildings. As I said, I think this would be a much more of a ambitious project one day, but to actually take the camera and go to, there are 3 sites in the Greater Toronto area where I think we could go to talk to the people who built them and maintain them, and bring them into the interview. So we'd have to go a bit mobile.
Oh, I'd love to see photos. Yeah. Okay.
Well, here's a bit of a contrary view on, the fact that there are opportunity costs when we want to create wetlands. There are also damages when we build in floodplains and we drain wetlands. And I recently wrote a piece just saying that beavers are having their media moment, and people in particularly the Western North America are trying to restore wetlands by reintroducing beavers and letting the beavers do the work of building dams and creating their own small wetlands. And the reason for that is to restore some of that connectivity that Brad was talking about with water, and bringing more water onto the environment, because their droughts and fires are such a huge issue now. So restoring beavers and wetlands has become a bit of a movement in various parts of the world. And there are lots of articles, mostly in popular media like the New York Times and Globe and Mail and CBC and The Guardian, about bring back the beavers, and they'll do a lot of the wetland restoration work for us if we manage it a bit. You can't let the beavers just run wild, or you'll have roads flooding and fields flooding, but beavers are not that difficult to manage, and we could work with them and restore some of the wetlands that would naturally occur in floodplains where we probably shouldn't have developed anyway.
I don't think it's contrary at all. The opportunity costs are to the individual who may own the piece of land. There really is a big difference between a private cost and a public cost. And so there is a public cost to draining a wetland and turning it into something else.
And the private people could have built a building there. Yes, I can see that. Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling to realize how much damage people have done to nature without necessarily much good reason for doing it. I mean, why did they kill all those beavers? Did anybody really gain that much from getting rid of the beavers? And why did they go around shooting all of the bison? Surely the bison didn't hurt anybody even then. I mean, did anybody benefit from that? Apparently there were even people on trains who go shooting out the train window just to see how many bison they could kill.
Different cultures have different views on how we interact with nature, and this quote unquote European settler cultures that have come to North America have a pretty different view from some of the indigenous cultures that we're I think making more of an effort to harvest in a sustainable manner than the sort of what you're citing about beavers and bison, and the list would go on, egrets and species that were just almost extirpated mostly for fashion, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I diverted us from what may have been the likely conversation at the beginning by bringing up this wetland business, but I think both of you are engaged.
I don't think you did. As I said, wetlands were part of a system of waterways. So it's a nice bridge if you want to talk about waterways.
Well, let's also talk about the pollution with things like fertilizer, phosphorus, and I guess it's not just phosphorus, it's mostly phosphorus, right?
The reason why I focused on phosphorus was not because phosphorus was the only nutrient that was coming off in excess from farmland and other sources. It became known as a trigger for harmful algal blooms. And so we began to really see through experiments and also through experiments nature conducted that when the phosphorus was reduced, the algal blooms were either reduced in frequency and or in spatial extent, or they didn't occur at all. So basically what that nature's experiment is a drought, not a lot of rainfall at the right time of year, and we don't get a lot of these algal blooms. But we have an experimental lakes area that has been used for these experiments as well. And we've been able to demonstrate the same thing in those experimental lakes, that phosphorus seems to be the trigger for these. Technically, they're bacterial. They're bacteria blooms, cyanobacterial. And, they're of concern because they grow so quickly. They cover a lake in a nice or not so nice green mat. I guess it depends on your aesthetic sense. And
now, wait a minute. Are we talking about the usual scum that we see on ponds, which I refer to as eutrophication, or are you talking about some other kind of green algal bloom?
So the pond scum, as far as, you can correct us, as far as I know, the pond scum we see some of that may in fact, yes, be due to nutrients, but I don't think it's cyanobacteria. It actually may even be cyanobacteria are not algae. They've been called algae, but they're not. And so I'm not, but eutrophication can happen for other reasons. But in this case, I'm talking about a number of species of cyanobacteria, or we call them blue-green algae because of their color, some of which are toxic. When they die, they release toxins which are not benign. They're not gentle. Exposure can can severely damage our livers, or some of them release neurotoxins that can be quite deadly. But even without the toxins, they can have dramatic ecological effects, at least for a short term, when they spread and then when they die. So phosphorus seems to be the trigger for these. And the other nutrients like nitrogen, carbon play a role. They play a role in which species predominate, but we focused on phosphorus because it was the trigger.
So Meta, some of your listeners will remember that I think it was August 2014 when the whole water supply for the city of Toledo, Ohio, had to be completely shut down because of these cyanobacterial blooms in Lake Erie. And Brad knows, I know a lot more than I do about this, but there's parts of the watershed of Lake Erie, particularly the Maumee River, which are really very heavily dominated by industrial agriculture, and there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen coming into Lake Erie from that particular sub-watershed of the Great Lakes, and it's very difficult to control those non-point sources of phosphorus. So Lake Erie is still considered to be, I think, polluted overly with phosphorus, and it's still suffering from these cyanobacterial or blue-green algae blooms. But
so you're not
it's
worried,
certainly not the only place.
You're not worried about the eutrophication. It's only this cyanobacteria thing that bothers you.
Oh, no, they're both a problem. Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, I was going to say, when the cyanobacteria, they don't live forever. They breed and they die. And then the process of their consumption creates eutrophication, areas of eutrophication on the lake. So you get one with the other. So yes, they're connected problems.
And eutrophication can mean that oxygen gets depleted. So if fish die, and their whole areas of what are called dead zones around the world at the mouths of major rivers like the Mississippi, which has got so much agricultural nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, that the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi empties into it, just doesn't have enough oxygen to support a full food chain. And so you only have those bacteria that we were talking about earlier that can thrive in the absence of oxygen, but higher organisms like us, by and large, we need oxygen to consume our food, to burn our food.
Okay, straighten out my head about the difference between the phytoplankton in the ocean and these algae. Algae.
I've heard both terms, but yes.
But you know, I've been in touch with people who want to revive life in large areas of the ocean that they call deserts, because there's not enough iron there. And if you sprinkle just a tiny bit of iron in the ocean, it will stimulate the growth of phytoplankton, which attracts billions of fish, or creates opportunities for billions of fish to live. And then it also captures CO2, and it takes it to the bottom of the ocean if it isn't eaten. So, what's the difference between what you're talking about, the runoff of fertilizer into the Gulf, Gulf of Mexico, as a source of life, and the growth of phytoplankton in the ocean, and do they go together, or is there any connection?
Maybe I'll start by saying that iron fertilization is one of many geoengineering approaches to trying to increase nature's ability to take carbon up from the atmosphere. And there are other geoengineering proposals like you were saying cloud brightening and
Mm.
maybe, putting sulfur particles up into the atmosphere and actually blocking solar radiation. I worked with the Convention on Biological Diversity for a number of years when I was with Environment Canada. So we did look at the full range of geoengineering proposals. And we weren't, countries around the world weren't particularly keen on any of them, I guess I could say, including the iron fertilization idea. It doesn't necessarily lead to a big phytoplankton bloom and then a death of phytoplankton and a sinking of all that phytoplankton with its carbon down to the depths of the ocean, where it will stay as fixed carbon and not be recycled as carbon dioxide, and you haven't made any net benefit other than you've sort of messed around with the chemistry of part of the ocean. So I mean, geoengineering, maybe it will be our last resort. And there's a lot of research, and I'm not that up on it. And I don't know about you, Brad, but it's a whole topic unto itself.
I wouldn't actually like to lump everything together and just call everything geoengineering. Personally, I think that you have to look at things separately in terms, not everything is equal to everything else. And just the word lumping things together and just calling everything geoengineering is, I think, frankly, sloppy.
Yeah.
Well, fair enough, but
Yeah.
but the biodiversity crowd, they need to do their work as blocks of stuff, and so there were a
Well,
lot of.
but it's not helpful, frankly. I think it's not helpful if you just apply a label to something and therefore don't investigate the various possibilities. I don't think that's good science, frankly. But I don't want to start a fight over it, and that's not my intention, because I wouldn't have even used the word. But what I was asking is, what's the connection between phytoplankton and algae? And is there this business of the runoff of fertilizer material into the ocean and the problems that causes? How is that related to, or is it the same thing as the development of phytoplankton? Because you have to realize I'm not a scientist, and
most phytoplankton need oxygen, so they won't. Phytoplankton are higher organisms, but they're not bacteria. It's the microbes that, like the blue-green. There probably are some cyanobacteria that can function without much oxygen. I'm not that expert on this, but most phytoplankton will die in a dead zone. So those Gulf, and that's what is the basis of the food chain is phytoplankton, not really bacteria. Though I guess maybe Brad, a little more about it. I don't think you would include nanobacteria in the ocean as part of the plankton.
No, I wouldn't. They're really separate issues. There is runoff from agriculture into the ocean, and in that sense, it's nitrogen that's a nutrient of greater concern than phosphorus, but it also produces what they call the red tide, which I have to be careful. Red tide may be due to other pollutants, but there definitely is a problem with blooms, bacterial blooms in the ocean, but it's a different species, and there the concern is nitrogen, but it's still connected to runoff from agriculture. Increasing the growth of phytoplankton in ocean deserts is a very different issue. It's not really connected with runoff from agriculture at all.
Okay, thank you. I'm
Well,
glad to get them straightened out, because in my mind I got confused about what's the connection, if anything. Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about contamination of you Ole have worked on radiation contamination. Is that right?
To some extent, though, frankly, Meta, I studied a bit more the contamination of soil and land than water bodies from uh, radioactive accidents and um, disposal of radioactive wastes. There are people who know a lot more, for example, about the waterborne emissions from the nuclear power plants on the Great Lakes, Darlington, Pickering, which do discharge significant quantities of certain radioactive pollutants, particularly the heavy form of hydrogen, which is known as tritium, which is radioactive, and that's probably the most controversial of the regular power plant emissions to water in terms of the disputes about how harmful that is in terms of human health. But it's probably airborne emissions from nuclear facilities that are having are more concerned and need to be controlled more carefully than the waterborne emissions. Just because, well, you take Lake Ontario, for example, it's such a big lake, and if there's enough distance between the point of discharge of a power plant and the intake of a public water supply, then that gets factored into the limits for how much a radioactive pollution can be discharged. And people say, well, there's a big dilution factor there.
But you're saying that there's airborne pollution from power plants?
Oh, absolutely. That's from coal plants for sure. Everybody knows about that, but also from nuclear plants, and particularly when they're shut down and started up, there are radioactive forms of krypton and xenon, and carbon-14 comes out, and so there are emissions from power plants. And again, that's very controversial about, is there a measurable health impact on people that live close to them?
Mm-hmm.
But this is not what we were supposed to be talking about today. So,
well, we don't have any rules about who's allowed to talk about what. But let me ask another connected question, which is, I hear about bad things around Mayak in Russia, and that river. That I think there's also the rivers that lead into the Arctic Ocean, and that there are submarines in the Arctic Ocean and other sources of nuclear contamination in that part of the world. What I wonder is, this could be just part of somebody's propaganda campaign if they want to talk about that more than something else. Would you say there's any reason to think that the Russian nuclear, not only the nuclear industry in terms of nuclear power, but also nuclear weapons, that all of their work with nuclear materials is any more dangerous or any different in the kinds of dangers than those that we would experience from, just having Hanford or, having Chalk River or some of these other things that we're used to living with.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Mayak, and the risks are pretty much the same. During the early years of nuclear weapons, the big Cold War nuclear weapons race between the US and Russia in particular, the production of plutonium was very sloppy in both countries, but in Russia there was that big accident, probably the world's third worst nuclear accident that people haven't even heard of because it was covered up. So that you had Chernobyl and Fukushima, but there's also Mayak and Chelyabinsk and the Techa River, as you mentioned, and some plutonium reprocessing waste tanks that were not full of plutonium, but were full of the fission materials that were separated from plutonium, basically exploded and contaminated a very large area. But before they were using those tanks, they were just dumping those wastes right into the river or into the lakes. So and at Hanford, it wasn't quite so bad, but a lot of the tanks have leaked and there's a lot of groundwater contamination and it's getting into the Columbia River. So on a global scale, this is sort of much more localized than the sort of agricultural pollutants or human pollutants from urban sewage plants. But there are areas around the world where it's pretty serious and have rendered parts of the local environment really uninhabitable.
That's what I'm wondering. How much would you say that the monitoring of waterways is adequate for public safety in general in the world? Do we have enough people, or sensors, going around monitoring things to detect hazards? Or does that vary very much from one place to another? Not just nuclear, but all of these things, cyanobacteria and whatever.
Yeah. When I've talked to people on the monitoring side, anybody who looks at data, they'll always say there's not enough. And quite frankly, if you really want to understand how a certain pollutant is really flowing through a system, not only do you need data through time, you need data at a fairly good resolution, meaning monitoring stations fairly close together over a geographic area as well, to really understand how a pollutant is flowing, transforming, etc. But it's not only that. I was really, I won't say perturbed, and I wasn't even totally surprised, but about 8 years ago, I worked with some people and we took a look at a number of policies in urban areas in Ontario and the US and Canada in general within cities to control phosphorus and other related nutrient pollutants. And there are a lot of great ideas, a lot of interesting things that cities have been doing over the past, whatever, 10, 20 years. But when you wanted to see, did they work? I think of the 100 or so examples we had, I think we might have only had 2 where we could actually point to them and say, the impact of these policies was monitored and we know how well they worked.
Really?
So it's not just, are we monitoring the bad, it's also, are we monitoring the good? So we know so we know if something has been effective. And I think it's so I think monitoring is one of those things. It's like maintenance. We just kind of, it's not, I don't know if I want to use it. It's not exciting for a lot of people. It's just doesn't have the pull, the pull of the new and cutting edge, etc. But yet without the monitoring on one hand, without the maintenance on the, these solutions on the other hand, when we implement them, we are operating somewhat in the dark, and we're also jeopardizing our own success.
Okay, I want to watch out for risks, though. I mean, this thing about Flint, Michigan, which apparently people were being poisoned there for years and years. And I don't know whether people didn't know it, or they did know it and they hid it, or they didn't care, or I don't know what the politics of it was. But is it possible that there are a lot of other cities where people are being poisoned with the water and they don't know it?
Well, look at Walkerton. Look at all the boil water advisories on First Nations. Of course, there are hundreds, literally, of examples.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's some very good protocols in place in different parts of the world for specific toxins. And in water, and they work well. They're doing their job. People are protected. Does that mean we're protected against every toxin, even in those water systems and those jurisdictions? We don't know. And a part of it is there's always there's a lot of emerging toxins, in the sense, things that weren't an issue, but have accumulated to such a degree in the waterway that are now becoming an issue. And so this whole idea of, I want to get it right. Some people said the next global issue, after we have finally reduced our carbon load to the atmosphere, will be our bacterial load to our waterways.
Really?
Sorry, I may be wrong. I said bacteria, and that's not what I meant to say. I meant to say not bacteria, but the things that kill bacteria. The way we dispose of medications that are designed to kill viruses and bacteria. I've heard people, I've read it, and I've heard people say that that is a growing issue, and it may be the next global issue of concern that truly is global. But 30 years ago, it wasn't there. It wasn't an issue.
Well, now that's really interesting. I've talked to people in the One Health movement who are concerned about things like animals being fed antibiotics, and then they go pee and poop in the soil, and apparently those antibiotics are killing the bacteria that we need in the soil. So then you start thinking about, well, if you take certain pills that have the same antibiotic effects, and you pee, that goes in someplace. Are we contaminating our own Great Lakes with these pharmaceuticals that we're taking? I mean, that's the next question that would come up to me if I pursued the reasoning behind
or do we have a lot of happy fish?
Happy fish or I mean, if they say the fish eat the antibiotics, maybe it's back in the food chain. I don't know. Is there anybody pursuing that line of inquiry?
There's a bit of it. The one that I've looked at, a student of mine looked at this review, is the vertical wetlands have some effect on removing those antibiotics from the water. So wetlands may be one of the management practices we want to see more of if we're going to continue dumping these medications into the water. And I guess this is one of those things, like carbon's a hard problem. Carbon is everywhere, and greenhouse gases, the methane I might emit here or outside of this building could end up having an effect halfway around the world. But these medications, we don't have to be disposing of them in our waterways.
Well, can we burn them? I mean, maybe people should be told, be careful how you handle this stuff, because I never thought of them as lasting beyond, when they kill the bacteria. Anyway, I've really steered us off into a really weird topic, and I don't think we can get out of it because our time's up. But I shouldn't have brought this up, but it was. Sometimes I think about such things. Okay, this has been very good. Thank you. It always turns out that we talk about something that I never figured we'd ever discuss, but it's been very enlightening. So thank you both. And now we're all acquainted. So
yes. Thank you.
Been a good day.
Enjoyed it. Thanks. Good to meet you, Brad.
Okay.
Very nice speaking with you, Ole.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Meta, for introducing us and bringing us together.
Indeed. Take care. Project Save the World produces these shows, and this is episode number 519. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. You can share information there about 6 global issues, too. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click.